people have the frontline work to do without more training. And also extremely important, more security training, and if you'd allow me, I'll come back to that in a moment. The third conclusion that we came to was we said, okay, now let's talk about the facilities, and now let's talk about the buildings, because if it's right that there's a new job, and if it's right that you need more people to do that new job, then you can ask the question of how should they be housed? Where should they stay? What should their embassies look like? And it was interesting. We did, as I say, dozens and dozens of interviews, and we came to the conclusion that in every country in which the United States is represented, our diplomats and our representatives have a right to a safe and secure and clean and efficient and modern place to work. We also came to the conclusion that those places, in every case possible, shouldn't be outside of the city, that in every case possible they should try to display on behalf of the United States not a fearful image but a transparent and hopeful image. And we thought that the department should stop at this time in terms of the building program, not lose the budget and not take away the capacity of the department to continue to build new buildings, which is extremely important, but to consider some of the architectural questions and get some advice perhaps from others like who have been doing courthouses in the United States or other buildings around, and that the Secretary of State should have the capacity to decide where our buildings should be located in cities. But again, we said there should be a bias against sending these missions too far out of town. Final recommendation, and then I will turn this over to Ron, but it's one I hope that you will think about and perhaps we could talk a little bit about in the Q&A. We also concluded finally that the State Department needed to move from a system of risk avoidance to a system of risk management. And the reason we said that was that if it's true, again, logically, that you need more people, and if those more people are out in more places, and if you think about your buildings where there might be one building that's kind of the mothership in a country, but you've got American presence posts in various towns, American corners in various towns, virtual presence posts in various towns, people traveling all over, what happens? Well, the more people are out and the more they are engaged in societies, or as Ron will talk about, the more that they are actually engaged in Iraq or in Afghanistan, the chances are that somebody is going to get hurt. And I believe, and the Commission believed, that post 9/11, our society has to consider this issue of whether there are going to be more diplomatic casualties in order to pursue the challenges that face us around the world. And the Commission recommended to the State Department that it move from this system we have today of where the only job is to protect everybody to a consideration of what the larger mission is. And that if people had more security training and people had the kind of facilities that they needed and that the mission required it, that we move to a system of risk management rather than risk avoidance. We were very clear to say that this is not something the State Department should just wake up one morning and decide, because this is a question that society has to talk about. But we felt that given the challenges of September 11th and the post 9/11 world, that we needed to think again about the questions of security. We hope that this report will be of some use to the department. We tried very hard to make it a report that was practical. It doesn't involve any great thinking or changes in the law. We wanted it to be something that people could do if they had the will. But we are convinced that there's a new job out there to be done, that without this job being done, there's no possibility that the United States will be successful, that the U.S. will only be successful with a successful American diplomacy, and we hope that we made a small contribution to this through the thinking about the embassy of the future. I thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, now that Marcus told you at least 50% of what I was going to tell you, there's going to be some rapid restructuring here. You know, years ago, when my father, who was also a diplomat and before that a professor, was giving speeches, he would sometimes be asked long in advance to give a title for a speech. And he told me he would always choose Crisis in the Middle East because he was sure that when he came to speak, there would be one. I think it is becoming painfully clear that unless something really changes, the topic of the hollow foreign service is going to become equally a perennial of speeches. That is not quite such a happy consideration. I want to totally endorse the things that Mark has just gone over. I will try to work around them and not say them all over again. He mentioned the speech that Secretary Gates gave, and I think there was another element in that that bears repeating, not unique but well stated there. Secretary Gates pointed out that we are going to face almost certainly a series of problems. He mentioned global terrorism, ethnic problems, tribal and sectarian problem, conflict, weapons of mass destruction, failing states. He had a few more. And his point was that there were two things common to all of these. All of them are long-term. They will go past any one administration or one president. And none of them can be resolved wholly by military means. That again goes to the need for diplomacy. And the fact is, we have a hollow diplomacy. Mark just gave you some numbers on shortages. We are increasingly stretched. This year, we've decided that we will not fill 10% of our jobs around the world because we don't have the people to fill them. Now, what happens when you do that? It's not just that you don't, it doesn't really mean that you don't do a job. In most cases, it means you try to get the essential functions done by somebody else who's still there. So you stretch them to multiple things. And you can do that a little bit, but there comes a point at which you do less because you're simply answering more phone calls, more emails, more requests from Washington, and actually doing less of the real job. I want to note that this is not a problem of one administration. This is a problem which has come into being at least over the last 3 administrations, which is really 20 years now. Secretary Baker opened all the new posts in the states that emerged from the fall of Russia without enlarging the Foreign Service. Under the Clinton administration, we did something called right-sizing government. No, it was reinventing government. Well, we reinvented a smaller number in the State Department without figuring out any jobs that we could actually cut, so we let it go down by attrition. In the beginning of the Bush administration under Secretary Powell, they built back up. That has all evaporated, gone off to Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, what does that mean besides shortages? In Afghanistan, we put 1 State Department officer and 1 AID officer in each provincial reconstruction team. We have them in 25 provinces. That means that at the best, given the package of leaves and the need to have people have a little mental peace and get them out every so often, that means that at best, if we have no gaps between replacements, we'll staff these jobs 10 months out of 12. That is not a serious way to fight a war. AID has to contract about half of those jobs because they don't own the people to fit them. And this is a new kind of job. I remember traveling down to Najaf in southern Iraq when our post under the Coalition Provisional Authority had been under nightly attack for going on 10 days. And my colleague there had a phrase. He claimed he didn't originate it, but it was the first time I heard it from him. He referred to this as extreme diplomacy. They did defend that position. They kept it. It would have been a major political disaster for us to have been driven from that post. So we are doing some new jobs, but we see the problem of the shortages in a variety of ways. As I said, we put officers in these provincial reconstruction teams. Why do you put a State Department officer out there? Well, you expect him or her, and we had a lot of hers, to have good political judgment and sort of instincts. But ideally, not so ideally, really, they should bring area knowledge and language to their jobs. Military cannot expect to do that. It took until last year to create the majority of those jobs as language designated positions, because that means you have to have another year. In other words, if you have one person in the job and one person in training for a year for language and area studies, then that's two people for that same year instead of 1 year. I go through this kind of detail because it's important to understand the price of not having enough people. I think this is not a group to which I would have to explain that diplomacy is important, but I want to just note some kind of common, I think, misconceptions. Because when you start talking about the need for more numbers, one of the things you will often hear is, well, wait a minute, this is an interconnected world. We got the internet, we got the telephone, we got journalism, we've got the open media, we've got academics. Why do you need all these people? Why can't you just depend on all this other stuff? Why can't you deal with foreign leaders through the telephone and the internet more, and look to the news media to tell you what's going on? These are the most simplistic, misguided, incorrect presumptions you could possibly have for a great power to conduct diplomacy. First, let's take the media. The international coverage by American media has shrunk enormously. Every major newspaper has reduced its foreign bureaus. Every major television station has reduced its foreign coverage. The media increasingly depends on parachuting journalists into crises. When I was in Algeria, they were having a rather bloody war going on. It's not unimportant to us. Boston, by the way, lights itself in the winter with Algerian liquefied natural gas. The French government at the time was trying to talk us into a more active involvement in the war. And Algeria is a major power in North Africa. So it was not wholly irrelevant. On those few occasions when American journalists came to Algeria, they came first to the embassy to find contacts because they didn't know anybody. And in many cases, they didn't speak French or Arabic, so we would have to send them to the same rather narrow spectrum of contacts who spoke English. And that would be sufficient for them to stay a couple of days and produce a story and get out of Dodge. It was scarcely the basis on which we should be providing advice to our government as to why we didn't want to do what the French wanted us to do at the level of their president. You can't have that kind of knowledge in any other way except by having diplomats, by having diplomats on the ground. Academics are a wonderful resource. I've always tried to find and meet the best American and foreign academics who worked on any country that I served in. But academics, first of all, publish rather a long time after the fact. They are not working on a daily basis, and they are primarily focused on analysis, which is important. It's hard to make good policy with bad facts, but they are not focused on what do you do about it. I think it was Dean Rusk, but that may be an error, who said that academics think to a conclusion and diplomats think to action. They don't always think to action, they don't always get it right, but the point is they have a different focus. It cannot be replaced by trying to have somebody who knows a great deal about a subject but hasn't been in a place for 6 months or a year tell you what's going on now. And the third thing is that the internet and the telephone are somewhat overrated when it comes not to talking to somebody but getting them to talk to you, particularly if you want them to trust. I mean, even in America and with our internet, people are a little careful about where they put their credit card information. How much more careful do you expect a suspicious foreigner to be in divulging secrets or sensitive information about their national security? And they're still more defensive about the fact that it might become public. There's a very continuing problem in the last administration, maybe it's in this one too, but I'm out now. King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia absolutely does not want to talk substance on the telephone. And it really irritates him every time he gets a call and somebody tries to discuss something important on the telephone, because he knows great many people are listening to that call. It is scarcely private. So you have to be there, and you're not just reporting, the general trade statistics, but you are, as a diplomat, developing a textured, nuanced sense of not only what people say, but what they mean and what they want. In some cases, how far you can push them. In other cases, how you can shape a message over time, perhaps, in multiple channels. One of the problems I had in Afghanistan, never really solved, was trying to tell the Afghans, when you go to certain Gulf Arab states and you want to get projects funded, these are very small governments. They're working on triage with an overflowing in basket. So if you want to do something, you have to set it up before the visit, use the visit as an action-forcing mechanism, and get a decision. If you put the project on the table in the visit, then they don't know what they're doing about it, so they say, we'll get back to you, and they mean it, but then it's overtaken by the next crisis, and you may not hear from them for 6 months. Again, you cannot prepare this kind of ground, so you have to be there. And that's probably enough on the why of diplomacy, but what I was trying to tell you is it illustrates the price of not having the people. And if you don't have enough people in post, then you have to send out the ones you have, so you then pay a price in training. If you're paying a price in training, then people have less job satisfaction. They know they're not doing their job as well. You have more morale problems. And it builds, it cascades, and it becomes worse year by year. And as you look at Secretary Gates's list of the future problems we know about, and when you look back at the last 10 years and list the problems we have dealt with, it would scarcely make you confident that our list for the next 10 years is going to be complete. It suggests that you have to have these resources. Now, we're doing something interesting, I think is interesting, in the American Academy of Diplomacy, which will build on the study that Mark talked about that CSIS did. We are trying to do, or we are doing, a study of what it would cost to properly fund the foreign affairs budget. Its major components, traditional diplomacy, we call it developmental, the public information function, and the crisis response. You need to understand that there is a basic way that budgets get done in Washington. You start with a base, and then you add a couple percent depending on what OMB will allow you, or you may lose a couple percent and then you have to go fight. And then you try to shoehorn, cram, use some Procrustean bed process to make the reforms you would like to get fit into that budget, or you do a kind of crisis operation, as the Secretary of State is now doing, to her credit, as Secretary Powell did before, to try to build up, but it is not very well sustained. Because of the nature of budgets, the incremental funding, it has been many, many years since anybody actually took a real baseline look at what would it cost, how many people do we need. We're not trying to say what would your foreign affairs budget be. That's another argument which will go on probably endlessly. But what does it need in people to do these jobs? And this is actually going to be pretty tough. The simplest part may be the State Department part, where at least we know how many people we're missing, and we can compose some idea of how many people it will take to have a reserve for training and transfers. It's going to be really tough in AID, because aid has so few people that it has used for years a series of decentralized program-funded mechanisms to hire people to do jobs which ought to be done by AID. When I first visited Afghanistan 40 years ago, aid was 10 times the size that it is now. It had a department that built a road. Now it has no department of engineering, so it has to contract. You hear a lot of complaints about contracting, many of them correct, but the fact is we have stripped the organization to the point where it has no other way to do business except to write a contract. So when you try to fix it by going after the contractors, you're essentially doing Band-Aids surgery on gaping wounds. In Vietnam, we had just about 300 people less in Vietnam in AID than we have now in AID in the entire world. This does not suggest that we are adequately staffed, but it does suggest, because we have been covering these gaps with decentralized programmatic hiring, that we're going to have a hell of a job figuring out how many people we actually need. So it's going to be a very interesting project. We will try to identify to the Congress, the executive branch, and the public, time for the next administration, not just that this instrument is hollow and broken, but what it would cost to fix it. And I think this is something that we've got to try to do, and I hope it will have some serious attention. It's going to be hard because Americans, in a sense, are sort of a blithe folk about foreign affairs. They're capable of rising to great heights of accomplishment, and they are soon distracted. I hope that's not you, but the fact is we don't always have as much patience, and it's nurtured by the 24-hour media cycle. And I find you tell people something, Afghanistan or whatever, is going to be a long job. People say, yes, right, got you. It's been 3 days. What have you done? Show me the accomplishment. We make it worse for ourselves, of course, because we write papers where we say something is long-term, but we never say how much you can expect to have in a year or two, so that we give the sense that when you make a policy decision, you'll have a result. Funding, that this particular case where it's not true, we made a decision in the fall of 2006 to add substantial money to the Afghan economic development budget. That request went to the Congress in February of 2007, gets voted out over the summer in various pieces, begins to get to people in Afghanistan to program the money in September 2007. By that time, you barely have time to start letting contracts, but if you want to build a road, winter is coming on and you can't do it. So the decision you made in 2006 to build a road will move dirt in 2008. We have to have a certain degree of patience, and we have to have the people, to go back to something Mark said, who are able to work in that interim. Because it's not about policy in that case, it's about how you use what you've already got and how you maneuver on the ground and what you do with it and how you react in 1,000 different decisions. And so we've got to be training people who have this sense, this ability not just to report and to analyze how to make policy, but who know how to push it forward and how to drive it. And we just have to do this if we are to measure up to the future demands that we will face, and we must plan and resource that now. Thank you very much.
Well, let me thank Ron and Mark for their very illuminating, sobering remarks. It's important for us to hear that. In just a moment, we'll go to questions. But ladies and gentlemen, we have a number of students here joining us from around the country. And I would say to you, and I'm sure my colleagues would echo this, that give some serious thought to careers in diplomacy. The challenges and the opportunities are really unprecedented. And don't stay on the sidelines. If you're interested, jump in, because I think your generation needs to be represented. Now, we'll go to questions. We will make the questions questions and not statements, if you understand what I'm saying. If you feel obliged to have a long statement, ask yourself the question, are you feeling lucky? I think I saw a hand here. Yes, ma'am. The microphone is coming here.
Thank you for your very important observations, and I agree that a strong State Department is very important to our nation. I wonder about the emphasis on the human resources and some of the budgetary things that might be done and aren't often talked about. We do pay a lot of attention to buildings. I mean, the price tag on the Baghdad embassy is quite huge. Redecorating ambassadors' houses every time an ambassador changes. I also think that we are one of the few, if not the only countries that has a PX in a nation, in a country, in a world that's makes products available. We ship toilet paper and Pop-Tarts to different countries on a jet. How can we make people
Madam-
more aware of budgetary requirements and cuts?
I'd be glad to start on that. First, I think that the issue, kind of the broader issue, has to be restated, which is that you can make all of the changes that you wish in the areas that you wish, from Pop-Tarts to marshmallow cream to residences, and it won't have the slightest effect on the impact of our diplomacy unless there are more people to do that diplomacy. And indeed, the fifth recommendation or sixth recommendation, I can't remember, of the Embassy of the Future report was very much that there needed to be continued streamlining in the administrative area. But all I can say is that the effort to revitalize this diplomacy needs many of the things that you say, but you can't do it without the people. So to take them specifically, I think the embassy in Baghdad, and we decided this for our commission, the embassy in Baghdad has to sit over here. You cannot, it seems to me, learn lessons about the rest of the world from that embassy. Second, that the situation that Secretary Powell found in 2001 in terms of the state of the buildings, for all of the effort that Secretary Albright and others had tried to put in, it was appalling. And we decided that, as I said, that people who serve us abroad ought to have the right to live and work in some place that was clean, efficient, and decent, and safe. And a lot of money has been spent. But when you talk to the people in these embassies, what do they say? They say, I love this place because it is all of these things, but how do I do my job? How do I do my job from out here? How do I do my job when I can't bring people into the embassy? How do I manage this new profession of mine? And so the challenge, it seems to me, is not to stop providing the right facilities for our people. The challenge is, in fact, to rethink the job and then rethink how you would diversify and distribute platforms in a new way. The other issues, I don't know. I served as an ambassador only once, but at DCM, I don't remember that there was ever very much refurbishing of the house. But as I say, the other issue is the issue really is you got to focus on the front end of this, and the front end of this are the people. And without more people, every other thing doesn't really matter.
If I could just add, to the best of my knowledge, the State Department does not subsidize PXs. We have PXs where we can piggyback on the military, and I could be wrong, and Mark or John can correct me, but most PXs that I've seen either are military or they're run by an embassy recreation association, which means they are self-funded, and they may get some break, but they're not. And yeah, some people would like their breakfast cereal, but they're not funded by the taxpayer. APO, post office, exists again only generally where you have the military in some numbers. Otherwise, your post comes out by diplomatic pouch. Doesn't get there necessarily quickly. And sometimes your Christmas presents arrive on time, and sometimes they don't, but many countries do not have dependable postal services, and it's a question of get your people's mail out to them in a diplomatic bag or get it stolen. And I don't wish to defend the embassy in Baghdad. For one thing, I had nothing to do with that decision. But I do want to say a couple things about it. Overall, it belongs in a one-off category. It should not become a leitmotif of other discussions. In fact, they started this after I left. The last time I saw the area where the embassy is built was when I could still walk down the Tigris before they put up sniper walls, when it was a bombed-out palace that Uday Hussein used to have before we put a couple of J-dams through the roof. And then we've cleaned it up a little since then. I know the basic rationale was that we had to build an embassy which could be so self-contained and so strong that even if we gave back the green zone and we did not have the external security of all that military force, we would be able to maintain a substantial diplomatic presence effectively in a war zone, something we've never tried to do before. Well, we have done it sometimes. We had a little problem in Saigon. They may have missized it. I don't know. They've certainly had contractor problems. I'm not trying to defend any of those pieces of implementation. I just wanted to give you a sense of, first of all, why they built such a large facility. And then there is a problem you get into in a place like Iraq or Afghanistan or any other crisis, which is the faster you have to make decisions, the more risk you have of making some mistakes and of having waste in the process. The more you encumber decisions with all kinds of regulations and processes to make sure your fiduciary responsibilities are meticulously carried out, then the slower you will make decisions. There is no one decision, there's no one way that's right, but there is a tension between speed and caution. And I find that we rarely speak honestly about that question. So generally, if you're too fast, you make a mistake, you'll be reamed for that. And if you're too slow and you can't move the money and your processes are too bureaucratic, then you're at fault for that. All I can tell you is that A, it will continue to be true, and B, there is no golden mean.
Yes, sir. Yes.
We spoke at some length about the human inputs as part of this. Oh, I'm sorry. Talked about the value of human inputs. Has there been much discussion about changing the process through which that bright graduate decides to join the Foreign Service? The actual recruitment and process through which you're hired?
The answer to that is yes. Although I have now been out of the Foreign Service for almost 3 years, Secretary Albright recognized that the system that we had was really broken. And the reason it was broken was that we weren't getting the right kind of candidates, that we were getting people who wanted to be in the Foreign Service, and yet then it would sometimes take 18 months to 2 years for a decision to be made about people's candidacy, up or down, and that we had a very big problem in terms of recruiting and retaining the right people. We were, although we did not, I think, realize it quite at the time, but we were in what was then called a war for talent. And Secretary Albright, as I say, recognized it and allowed a number of us, I happened to be the Director General at the time, to do some very interesting things that started on the path to change some of these processes. We were able to shrink the amount of time that security clearances took, for example. We were able to make it more technologically kind of easier to sign up for the test. But I must say that the real breakthrough came after 2001 for a couple of reasons. One is, as Ron said, because Secretary Powell was good enough to recognize that we needed this 15% float in training and transit, and we hired 1,180 people in the first 3 years of his administration. He kept forcing the amount of time that it took between application and job decision down. And secondly, that we were, I don't mean to use the word benefited here, you will understand what I mean, that after 9/11, very large numbers of people wished to serve. They wished to serve their country. We were benefited by the collapse of the dot-com industry, where people got to think that perhaps a pension was better than a 401k plan, and serving the United States was a plus. And also we had a huge positive kind of capacity through Secretary Powell and Secretary Rice to say, here, join something that's happening. So to give you some statistics that are at least in my head, and don't hold me to these numbers in particular. When I gave the Foreign Service exam for the last time when I was the Director General in 2001, we had about 13,000 people signed up for the exam. About 10,000 people actually came to take it. In the neighborhood of 3,000 or 4,000 people who were self-declared minorities. The second time, I believe, that the exam was given under Secretary Powell, we had 30,000 people take the exam, 18,000 of whom were self-declared minorities. And so you can see a huge kind of change in capacity. I think the people that were brought in during the Powell administration, and I hope subsequent to that, were spectacular people. I think they're going to be wonderful Foreign Service officers. And I believe they will be actually pioneers in something completely new. And so I really endorse what Marcus had to say to the students who are here. People who are starting a diplomatic career today are going to be pioneers in an exciting and new thing, and I believe the people we brought in at that time will. There are still more things to do. There's more diversity to be had in the Foreign Service. The Foreign Service continues to have to struggle with this issue of being really representative of the United States in terms of our diversity, which is a huge strength of the United States. It's still got to be possible to shrink down the amount of time it takes to make these decisions. But I say, sir, that I think they've gone quite a long way to make that a more positive experience for people.
Okay. Anyone on this side? Mark?
Is there any marketing to young children to become Foreign Service officers? Somebody who would say, let's be an action hero or a TV star or on the internet, or and also language is being brought up here in the background. When children are young enough not only to learn languages but also to invent them, and that's true, and you know it. But how about that? How about getting them started young? Give them a carrot.
I'm going to let Mark do the serious answer, but I just want to say that I would settle for one movie that had a positive depiction of a diplomat.
Right. Yeah. Yes, that's right. One of the good things about being not in the State Department is you're not in the State Department anymore. But the hard thing is I'd like to answer your question with a today answer rather than a what if answer. So let me focus, if I could, on the language question. Because that does speak to the issues of early education and having Americans more interested in languages. And one of the things that we certainly said in our report was that this capacity of people to speak languages is crucial to our ability to influence and understand other societies. Now, one of the strangest, I don't know if it's an irony or a strange development over the past few years, is that even with the expansion, as Ron said, of the internet and the telephone and all of these technological devices, in fact, I think a little bit as Tom Friedman has said, with individuals are actually more powerful today than they ever have been. And so what that means is that it's not good enough anymore for the diplomat to simply be able to run over to the foreign ministry and deliver talking points to someone else who is more or less like she or he in an elite, or speak to elites in country X or country Y, because now the individuals are so empowered and individuals are making many more of these decisions. And so I think the Department of State should continue to give incentives to people who speak languages. And the other thing that I think was a very interesting possibility is, of course, to increase the capacity of the department to recruit among first and second generation recent immigrants. So, for example, Arab Americans and Iranian Americans and Vietnamese Americans and Malaysian Americans, Pakistani Americans, Turkish Americans, people who come to you then perhaps not just with the language but also with a real feel for the culture as well. Mm-hmm. In terms of getting people young, one of the good things I think the department has done over the past few years is they have instituted, I think it's called the Hometown Diplomat. And they are encouraging people when they're back on home leave to go actually to the high school that they went to. Mm-hmm. And say, look, here I am, and you may not know what you want to do, but you have the capacity to represent the United States, which is a very unique privilege.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to go over on this side now. Yes.
Hi. First of all, thank you to both. Is there a microphone?
Yeah.
First of all, thank you to both of you. I know you've been good friends to the World Affairs Councils over the years, so I appreciate your coming here today. My question now is directed toward Ambassador Grossman. In your Embassy of the Future, was there any discussion of restoring either USIA or what had been the role of USIA? Because I think the outreach of our cultural centers, I think, did more to project a positive image of the U.S. than any of the marketing efforts that have been done in recent years. And I think, from what I've heard traveling around the Middle East, for example, that's what is missing in our diplomacy.
Yes. First of all, we thank you very much, as I did, for your support and for your interest. Yes, there was a lot of discussion, and I hope that you perhaps will take the time to look at the report, which you can get on the CSIS website. There was a very large component of the discussion and the recommendations that you will find about a return to the primacy and priority of cultural diplomacy. And we did this, we tried to talk about this in three ways. First, again, as I said to the gentleman who's just left, actually, this gentleman who's asked a very good question about kind of the people and the languages, because you're having now to try to influence individuals, then this capacity to speak to them and touch them and have a contact with them is extremely important, and that is cultural more than it is political or anything else. Secondly, it's why we recommended that there be this dispersion and diversity and moving out of embassy buildings, and so that we recommended many, many, many more American presence posts, for example, which are 1 or 2 person posts in cities around countries, because they have the capacity to influence and do things on culture. Second, we recommended a substantial increase in American corners, where the State Department now may contract with the university library, for example, where part of that library would show off things from the United States. We recommended a substantial increase in exchange programs. We thought those were very important as well. And there was a wonderful conversation, and I will sort of show my generation here, about a return to the cultural diplomacy of the music and the art and all of the things that I think people love about the United States. And I went through a period for myself when I was the ambassador to Turkey where I made the huge error of taking my USIA budget and saying, I don't want any more of this music and culture and pottery exhibits and all that stuff. I want to focus in on the press. And of course, it was a huge mistake, and I realized it a couple of years later, because it is the capacity of those things to translate into societies that are so important. We did not, though. We did not struggle or deal with the issue of whether there ought to be a new USIA. What we said was there's a huge gap in this area of cultural diplomacy, and it ought to be filled. Our own assumption was, again, because we didn't want to muddy this up with a lot of kind of, you have to move boxes around. We wanted to say, you could do this today if you wanted to increase the amount of cultural diplomacy. Go ahead and do it today. And if someday you want to do something with USA, fine. But today you could do more, and that's what we urged people to do.
Okay. Let's go in the middle of the room. Yes.
I don't quite understand what you were talking about when you say you were to move from a system of risk avoidance to a system of risk management. If you're actually talking about the physical safety of our diplomats, could you amplify why we would, what the benefits would be?
Yes, of course.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. The reason we decided to make this an issue in the report is that the bias that is in all of ambassadorial instructions, the structure of the department, is that under no circumstances should anybody get hurt. And that's a really important thing. And the report says, nobody who participated in this report is saying that we should, that shouldn't be a standard, that people should just be, put into harm's way because people in a commission decided that would be true. But this started like this, and let me kind of try to make this a personal story for you. When I was the ambassador to Turkey, I had a wonderful, courageous young woman who was our human rights officer. And she came to me, this must have been 95 or 96. And she came to me and she said, I want to go to the east in Turkey, in southeastern Turkey, for a couple of weeks and meet people and try to talk to people. And at the time, it was very, very, very dangerous there. And I said, no, actually, you can't. No, thank you. Not for me, not for you. And she said, well, why not? And I said, well, you don't have the training for this. We don't have really the capacity to protect you. The bias in everything that I have is that we can't do this. And I actually don't think the mission we would send you out on this day, this week, this month, is worth your life. And I said to her that I couldn't imagine my writing her mother and saying, something terrible happened here and I was responsible. I confess to you, though, that after 9/11, given the challenges that we face around the world and the need to influence people kind of far out at the edge, not only in their thinking but maybe geographically, that if that person was to come to me today and I was in the same circumstance, and if I could give that person some specialized training, in other words, if she got into some trouble, maybe she knew how to get out of that trouble in some special way. If I maybe could have for her a safe house, someplace to run to in the town in which she was working. If I felt that the BlackBerry she was carrying might be able to warn her against something. And that I felt that post 9/11, the mission that we needed to accomplish in this place was more important than it was before 9/11. I admit to you that I think my calculation might be slightly different. I don't know, but it might be different. And if it were different, and God forbid something terrible were to happen, would I be in a better position to have said then to my superiors and to her family, I did this. I let her go, but I let her go because she was better trained. I let her go because I fixed the circumstances to the best of my ability, but I took this risk because on behalf of the United States of America, I thought this job needed to be done. And I think that's true, or at least it ought to be debated. And if it is true, then the letter that each ambassador receives from the President of the United States needs to say, you are responsible for making sure everybody is safe. But you're also responsible for accomplishing this mission, and if it turns out that there are times when people have to take some risk, you better make sure that you've managed that risk rather than avoided it. It also means that the whole structure that arrives after something terrible happens, it's called the Accountability Review Board, is now structured in such a way that if anything happens, it has to have been bad. They're not interested in the mission. And we said in the report that there has to be some capacity to take into account the mission that was trying to have been accomplished. That's not a very good sentence, but you understand what I mean. What was the objective? Why did you send that person out there to take that risk? And my own view is that if you ask people to leave that compound, which I think you should, if you ask people to be engaged in society, which I think you should, then our society, American society, has to understand that more people are at risk. And that is a risk to be managed and not avoided. And I hope that is an answer to your question.
I'd just like to add something to that, because I seem to have had an unusual attraction, or wars have had an unusual attraction for me, having not only served in the Army in one, but in Algeria, Baghdad, and Afghanistan. There is always first of all, there's always a question of how much risk for how much gain. I once vetoed a trip in Algeria to a rather dangerous area because I felt that what the people would see was a single snapshot of a multi-thousand frame moving picture, and it didn't give us very much for the risk. I would take a much larger risk to know something critical. There's a trade-off. Secondly, we have, not only in Afghanistan and Iraq, although those are two major places, but a number of other countries, we are putting people in positions where we want them to do things, as Mark was talking about. We want them to build projects. We want them to influence the government. We want them to influence provincial development councils and to support them and to strengthen them. And we have a lot of very dynamic people. And those people are constantly pushing the edge of the bureaucratic envelope because they are putting their jobs, the accomplishment of their job, ahead of themselves. I don't mean, we haven't lost very many people. We're doing a fairly good job. But we're putting the responsibility on the individual because we give them no bureaucratic cover. And we have the Accountability Review Board. I had an experience with that in Baghdad when I was acting deputy to the ambassador. We had somebody get killed. They broke every rule we had about going outside and how you do it, and they were scornful of the rules which they broke. And the Accountability Review Board agreed that the rules were known, they were repeated, the people knowingly broke them repeatedly. Having decided that, they then imposed worldwide a whole series of additional strictures on ambassadors and embassies because they had to do something, I think. What we're saying has to be very carefully understood and nuanced, because we're not saying you should go throw your people's lives in danger. But they have to have both the training and the protection. That's our responsibility. We haven't always done this well. We've been very slow about getting some kinds of protective equipment and armored vehicles out to our people. We were desperately slow in Iraq. The first ambush of State Department people came only a month after they'd gotten the first armored vehicles out to them in the field. But we also have to give them bureaucratic backing so that it's not just on the individual to decide whether they're going to break regulations or stretch them. And we desperately need it. In one last story, and I'll quit. In Kandahar, which is a damn dangerous province in Afghanistan, we had a very, very talented, dynamic woman who was our aid officer. She knew tribes. She was hugely effective. We turned that PRT, the Provincial Reconstruction Team, over to the Canadians. Canadians got a diplomat killed in a roadside bomb, and they basically locked up all the civilians. Only the military goes out the wire, no civilians, there's no escort for civilians. You're done. You're useless. You've got all the effect of an ashtray on a motorcycle. However, this aid officer managed to lash up with the U.S. Special Forces. She got out and she did her job by going with Special Forces. She was in 2 convoys that got blown up. Thank God she didn't die. But she got her job done, but she's doing it on her own. We're putting her out at the edge because we're not giving her... That's what I'm talking about. We have to constantly manage that balance between accomplishing job and taking risk. And there is no cookie-cutter answer. Every situation, every mission is going to be different.
With that excellent exchange, I think we're going to have to leave it right there. Let me first thank you all for coming and for your excellent questions. Secondly, I want to thank our 2 speakers, Ambassador Newman and Ambassador Grossman, for their candor. If you could just stay put for a moment, I have 2 quick announcements. Tonight's receptions, you know where you're going. It's listed in the program in your brochures. The buses will leave around 6 p.m. At the Pennsylvania entrance. 6 p.m.